Wrong way, down the one-way street.
So a couple of weeks back, I released this video. A video detailing in great detail essentially why Griffith did nothing wrong, from both a moral and legal perspective. And the response I got back was actually a lot better than I expected. Unlike my first video, where I got ratioed to hell and back for claiming Griffith was a selfless person motivated by empathy, people were more warmly receptive to my assertion that Griffith wasn't accountable for the Eclipse due to the manipulation of the God Hand and his mental state at the time. This reaction falls in line with the more mainstream defenses of Griffith's decision, as it's much easier to understand obvious manipulation when you see it than it is to aptly follow the complicated arc of a character designed to be intentionally ambiguous through his dialogue and actions. Even real-life lawyers were supporting me, so I must have been right. Still, it's pretty scary that over half of the people who watch that video either don't understand or don't care about how informed consent works. And to all of those people, I'd suggest you stay as far away from women as possible, cause you give off pretty rapey vibes. Now, while most of the comments took this road in continuing to condemn Griffith, just blatantly throwing out all sense of morality cause they really don't like the guy, fucking snowflakes, that wasn't the only criticism I received. A lot of people didn't buy my assertion that Griffith was manipulated, or that he was stripped of any real choice. And they most certainly didn't like my assertion that Griffith and Femto were fundamentally different. So to demonstrate how I was wrong, they brought up an example of a very similar situation earlier on in the story. That being the Slug Count's audience with the God Hand in the Black Swordsman arc. Now, at face value, this argument seems to make a lot of sense. Just like Griffith, the Slug Count was at his lowest point when confronted with the God Hand. He was offered the same choice as Griffith, to sacrifice the thing he loves most in the world in exchange for greater power, to be saved from a harrowing death. He was confronted by the same eldritch beings in the exact same scenario, and unlike Griffith, the Count still possessed enough love for his daughter, Teresia, to refuse the God Hand's offer, sacrificing his life for hers as he was dragged into the vortex of souls for all eternity. This framing paints a pretty bad picture for Griffith, and it's a mainstream argument widely expressed throughout the Berserk community. The problem with this is that it's really not true. The only real way you can draw this comparison is by being incredibly reductionist in your analysis, oversimplifying the context of both situations to the point of meaninglessness. This is a broader problem with the Berserk community, where they seek to draw parallels in the story that simply aren't there, mostly between Guts and Griffith, but that's a subject for a later video. Now, there are at least 7 important factors in distinguishing the Count from Griffith that prove why no moral equivalence can be drawn between them. For one, drawing an equivalence between the Count and Griffith in terms of informed knowledge of the situation and contract is just ridiculous. The most obvious rebuttal of this argument is the fact that the Slug Count is an apostle and Griffith is a human. The Count had literally been through all of this before. He was experienced and fully informed about the nature of the sacrifice, as well as the terms and conditions of the contract. This is not at all the case with Griffith, who had only had 2 brief encounters with apostles beforehand, and who showcased a clear lack of understanding of their true nature through his poetic pondering of Zod's existence. What's more, the God Hand did not go out of their way to withhold information or lie to the Count about any of the conditions of the sacrifice, like they did with Griffith. When arguing with people online about how Griffith did nothing wrong, you'll usually be met with really long-winded, tedious narrativizing about everything he did bad in chronological order, and every time you get the same argument that he condemned them to eternal suffering in the vortex of souls to achieve his own selfish dream. It doesn't really make any sense to bring this up though, because Griffith didn't know about the vortex of souls. The God Hand never told him about it. On the contrary, the way Slan described the Hogs' fate ushered up the image of paradise and eternal celebration, nothing like the infinite torment and suffering they actually experienced. With the Count, they not only told him about it, but they literally showed it to him. It took up the entire backdrop of the sequence. There was no ambiguity as to what would happen to the sacrifice after death, and it's in this sense that the God Hand's manipulation doesn't apply to the Count. They never attempted to manufacture the consent of the sacrifice like they did with Griffith. They never made any kind of assurance that Teresia would consent or forgive him for being sacrificed after the fact. He knew exactly where she was going, right there, to suffer in hell for all eternity, and the look on her face said it all. She wasn't happy with going there. This isn't at all the case with Griffith. Slan told him that she could read their minds and knew that the Hawks would forgive him for being sacrificed and welcome him warmly. He's told to commit his fragile self to them, to their will, to make good on their sunk cost fallacy. The God Hand purposefully showcased their mind-reading abilities in showing him every facet of his history and past motivations, to lay the foundation of their manipulation here. And I know a lot of you will make the argument that this isn't actually what Slan said, and that I selectively cherry-picked the 1997 anime dub translation instead of the manga to support my argument. You assert that her words here were giving Griffith the choice to refuse the sacrifice and go back to his men who would welcome him warmly and look after him thereafter, so that he could go on living. But this makes literally no sense, because in the very chapter before, the God Hand tell him that if he does not continue piling up the corpses to get to his dream of a castle, he will become a corpse like them. He will die. They literally say,
"There is no other choice. May the cobblestones let you lie next to him."
So Slan can't be offering an out here. A corpse isn't a cripple, and they had already stated that the only way that he could go on living was if he continued the path to his dream. They can't be referring to death of natural causes, because there's no indication from any of the Hawks that Griffith is on death's door. Their plans to support him are long term, and Griffith seems confident in a future with Casca where he lives out a long, peaceful existence. Unless you really want to make the argument that the God Hand are talking about Griffith dying of old age at like 85 years old or something, this line of dialogue can reasonably be considered to be a threat, and further exemplifies how the God Hand's offer was coercive and exploitative. So checkmate, Adonis. People really don't like to care though. They feel no sympathy towards Griffith for being seemingly too stupid to pick up on the God Hand's lies and manipulation, while forgetting that he was in a suicidal, emaciated, hallucinogenic state, had just been thrown from a wagon, and was being faced with beings and concepts beyond his comprehension. You can't expect someone in that state of mind to possess the faculties and critical thinking abilities to discern fact from fiction. It's not fair, and it's another advantage the slug count had over Griffith that makes any comparison between them null and void. While it's true that the Count was at his lowest point when he activated the Baelid, in the sense that he was on death's door in total desperation for survival, he wasn't mentally ill. He was in full possession of his faculties and could clearly discern what was real from what wasn't, and he wasn't experiencing hallucinations. And speaking of which, an important thing to bring up here is the fact that apostles exist at a higher level of consciousness than humans, with at least some insight into the plans of the idea of evil and fate. We can see this when Zod tells Guts of a prophecy that Griffith will sacrifice him, and later on when he seems to take the outcome of Doldry as a sign that the eclipse is imminent. It stands to reason that the Count also has this ability, alongside the other apostles that gathered for the feast. It's in this sense that the power dynamic between the Count and the God Hand is much less extreme than that of Griffith, in terms of understanding the metaphysics of the eclipse and the terms of the contract, and so it's quite a bit harder to make this ensign out to be coercive and non-valid. The God Hand never appealed to fate with the Count. It was clear that it was his own decision that he must make of his own free will. They gave him the option not to sacrifice Teresia, and that it was his choice. This is a far cry from the call for Griffith to act on the will of God and assuring him that fate had set him free from human reason, stripping him of any real choice by appealing to a higher authority, and literally telling him that there was no other option. The idea of evil only told Griffith to act on his own free will after the sacrifice had already taken place, and he only told him this to undermine Griffith's impression that he had been acting on God's will in the eclipse up until that point. I suppose it speaks to the relative unimportance of the Count's encounter with the God Hand that there was a much lower emphasis on fate and causality compared to the bicentennial eclipse. Not only that, but in terms of a moral comparison, the Count was offered a selfish dream, whereas Griffith was not. The Count was offered even greater power in exchange for sacrificing his daughter so that he could go on living, and he selflessly refused. The God Hand told Griffith to selflessly act on the will of the fallen and make good on the sacrifices his men had made up until that point, to allow their souls to rest in peace. They play on Griffith's extreme sunk cost fallacy, predicated on the inherent value of his men's lives, dreams, and labor, and it's inherently selfless and rooted in empathy. For all of these reasons, you cannot draw comparisons between the Count and Griffith to pretend that they were offered the exact same thing and that the Count is a better person than Griffith somehow, because that's just stupid. So now we've got that out of the way, we can focus on the second argument a lot of people like to make in condemning Griffith. The fact that the Count refused to sacrifice Teresia, despite the harrowing fate that was presented to him, an eternal vertex of suffering and lost individuality. It speaks to the Count's empathetic nature that he was still able to do this as an apostle, and indicates that the transformation doesn't actually strip you of your effective empathy and human compassion. At least not completely, meaning that my assertion that Griffith and Femto are different people is entirely wrong, and human Griffith is still condemnable for Femto raping Casca. Now this argument comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of Berserk's lore and metaphysics. At face value, it seems to make sense to draw this comparison, as both the Count and Griffith underwent a transformation into a magical being after accepting the same offer made by the God Hand, to sacrifice their most beloved thing. But if you think about it for more than 2 seconds, the comparison becomes laughably silly. Why on earth would you assume that the transformation would affect an apostle and a God Hand member in the same exact way? The Count's transformation turned him into a person who could take the form of a monster slug. Griffith's transformation turned him into a being that can warp space and time, read minds, and delve into the deepest depths of the astral world. These aren't even remotely the same kind of creature. The effect of the transformation is clearly much stronger for Griffith, in that it had the power to turn him into a near omnipotent god. To assume that the transformation's psyche-altering effects would be at the exact same magnitude for both Griffith and the Slug Count, when literally every other aspect of it caused a massive disparity in their power, is laughable. Use your noggins. Even Ubik himself stated that the transformation's empathy-inhibiting effects would be different. In explaining the terms of the sacrifice to the Count during the ceremony, he mentions that by sacrificing Teresia, he will shed any last remnants of his humanity, indicating that he lost most of his human compassion during his initial ascension to apostlehood, and this last sacrifice will cast the little he has left into the abyss, leaving his heart completely frozen. This detail is important, in that it indicates the compounding effect a larger number of sacrifices has on the power of the transformation. The more bodies you pile up, the stronger the transformation becomes. With this in mind, it's easy to see why the transformation had a greater effect on Griffith's frozen heart. He sacrificed hundreds of comrades that he loved and cherished dearly. That is why you can't compare them. And this is another condition of the contract that the Count was more informed about, by the way. The Count was told by the God Hand that he would lose his human compassion in the transformation, entirely unlike Griffith. He'd already been through that loss of humanity before. In fact, it was the sole reason that the Count accepted the initial offer years ago, to free him of the grief that he felt towards his heretical wife. Griffith, in stark contrast, wasn't told anything, and he expressed surprise in losing his empathy when it happened. He didn't consent, and so human Griffith isn't accountable for Femto raping Casca. Cope! There can be no denying that Griffith lost his empathy here. In my first ever video, I called out Kyle Entertainment for his bad opinions on Griffith, but for some reason I never ended up mentioning his opinions in the video itself. His most popular video, Why We Hate Griffith in a Single Phrase, echoes one of the most common rebuttals to my idea that Griffith as a human was empathetic. One line, "I want wings." They use this iconic line as evidence that Griffith was always a psychopathic piece of shit, devoid of empathy. And I'm not gonna pretend that this isn't canon, I'm not that silly, but this idea doesn't hold true, because Griffith said the line, "I want wings," directly after he had already had his personality artificially altered by the transformation. He had lost all affection for his men in that moment, so he could only bask in the immense power he was being given. It's not at all representative of Griffith's character throughout the Golden Age arc, and it doesn't at all encapsulate everything we've hated about Griffith since the beginning, because this isn't Griffith. Awful video. Go give it a watch. So after all of this back and forth with a lot of my critics, once they no longer have the ability to prove any of my points wrong, or they grow fatigued by my incessant arguing, you'll usually be met with the same general cop-out regarding my analysis of the Count's parallel to Griffith and the broader context of Griffith's choice in the Eclipse. That if I'm right, that would ruin Griffith's character and make Berserk badly written. You see this sentiment everywhere in my comment sections. I posted the scripts in my previous video on my anime list, and the responses were the same. They appeal to how my application of morality and legality to the Eclipse ruins the thematic relevance of the Eclipse to the broader story, and that by stripping Griffith of his agency by talking about informed consent and separating Griffith and Femto as characters, I've essentially ruined the story for them and insulted what they've decided to be Miura's message that he's trying to convey in the story. Here's the thing though, you can appeal to "that would make Berserk bad" as an argument. Maybe Berserk is bad, based on your interpretation. You have to meet my arguments with in-universe talking points and textual evidence. You can't just ignore things that are blatantly written in the text because it doesn't align with your idea of what Berserk should be in your own head and what you think makes it well written as a story. You're putting the cart before the horse. The text should inform your interpretation, not the other way around. Now, it's entirely possible that Miura's intention with the Count was meant for him to act as a juxtaposition to Griffith, to really nail home just how inhuman and psychopathic Griffith really is. Miura could have intended for Griffith's choice in the Eclipse to highlight his unforgivable evil and selfishness. I don't think this was his intention in either case, but I understand where the sentiment comes from. The problem with this line of thinking is that you aren't actually criticizing my arguments. You're unknowingly criticizing Miura's writing skills. By protesting that my arguments that you failed to disprove would ruin the thematic brilliance of Berserk and Griffith's character writing, while undermining Miura's intent within the story, all you're doing is pointing out flaws within the narrative itself, not Sichlitt. You're highlighting clear dissonance between authorial intent and the actual execution of that thematic intent through the storytelling. If you're going to cling on to your idea of what the point of Berserk is and what Miura was trying to say, you have to take this line of logic as a criticism of his writing and an acknowledgement of the story's potential flaws, for the inconsistent portrayal of its themes through the characters. Maybe Berserk isn't perfect. Maybe Miura isn't perfect. Maybe he shouldn't have written Griffith's character to be in such a compromised position if he wanted the message to be one of Griffith's mistakes and accountability for the Eclipse. Be brave and take that idea forth to criticize a story we all like a lot. I doubt many Berserk fans would be willing to do that though, so the only alternative is to adopt my interpretation of Griffith's character. If I'm poking holes in your interpretation with textual evidence and you have nothing to counter it, you can't appeal to how that would ruin your interpretation. The honest, principled thing to do is change your interpretation to align with mine. The lesson from the recent arcs on my channel is honesty, I think. And if Berserk fans had more of it, then no one would disagree with me. Stop being so stubborn and admit that Griffith did nothing wrong. Ladies and gentlemen and non-binary kings, that's it for another video. It was meant to be a short follow-up to my last one about Griffith's innocence to clear up some misconceptions and debunk some criticisms, but it ended up being quite a lot longer than that. My arguments about authorial intent versus execution at the end there hint at a topic that I'm going to be discussing in either my next video or the one after, where I delve into the validity of a lot of common parallels people draw between Guts and Griffith, and their perception of the characters as two sides of the same coin, and how they use that to draw false moral conclusions. I recently streamed for the first time recently on YouTube as well, where I went over some annoying comments as well as a sneak peek at some unfinished projects of mine. Go check it out!